Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait a few more minutes, or not minutes, a few more seconds while other people join. All right.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sam Fletcher. I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Chapter of NASW. This is part of our series of chapter chats, which is a way for us to socially connect while we physically distance during COVID. I want to thank Jessica and Alex so much for doing this tonight. They're extremely involved with the chapter. We do all sorts of initiatives with them, and they understand voting and all the ins and outs better than anyone I know. So I'm extremely grateful that they decided to do this with us, and I know that we're going to learn a lot. So now I'm going to hand it over to Amelia, and she's going to let us know how we're going to interact tonight with Jessica and Alex.
All right. Hi everyone. My name is Amelia. I'm from the New York State Chapter of NASW. I'm going to go over a few things. You might already know how to use Zoom, but if you're newbie like I was at one point, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how we're going to engage with one another. We're going to ask that you keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. During the presentation, there's going to be times when you can have questions or you want to respond to something. We're going to ask that you raise your hand or write in your questions into the chat box. If it comes a time that's organic for us to have some conversation, we're happy to have you unmute yourself and speak with our two presenters tonight. I do want to make the point that this is not a CE program. We do have many CEs available, some of which are held on Zoom as well. If you'd like to take a CE program with us, shoot us. I'll shoot the schedule into the chat box and we can direct you to the right place, but just want to be mindful that this program in particular is not for CE tonight. So I'm not going to take up any more of our time because I don't have the information in my head. I'm going to hand it over to our two amazing presenters for tonight, Jessica and Alex. Thank you both.
Thank you. I guess we should introduce ourselves first. So my name is Alexandra, but you all can call me Alex. I am a recent Stony Brook University graduate. I just received my MSW. I'm doing a lot of work right now involving tele-advocacy, in which our organization, New York Social Action, pushes for equitable policy through various different lenses, such as criminal justice reform, civic engagement, healthcare, and I'm also involved with the NASW on their Advocacy and Government Relations Board committee and PACE.
Hi, I'm Jessica Mitchell. I am an adjunct professor at Stony Brook. I'm also a PhD student right now at Wurzweiler, getting my PhD in social work. And I have spent many years working in politics. And the one thing that I have consistently cared about my entire life since before I could vote is voting rights. I was registering people to vote long before I was actually eligible to vote. So I love talking about this stuff. I love getting people involved in politics. It's so important. I particularly care about voting in non-presidential years, but it is a presidential year, so it's the time to engage people who wouldn't otherwise be engaged. So hopefully we could do that and then keep you engaged going forward. So I'm going to share my screen. We have some stuff to share with you guys, and then we are happy to take questions at the end and have more of a discussion if people are interested in doing that. So can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Alex, you can start.
Okay. We should start where we last left off, which was the 2016 presidential election. This was the first general election since the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, which we'll go into a little bit more detail towards the latter half of the presentation. But briefly, for those of you who don't know, this was when a court case known as Shelby County v. Holder, which we'll also be covering later. This is, sorry, my screen just froze. This court case removed a lot of the protections that this act put together in order to prevent instances of voter suppression from happening. So the voter turnout during this election was about 61.4% nationally. The Black voter turnout rate declined for the first time in 20 years. In 2012, it was 66.6%, and in 2016, it dropped to 59.6%. The Latino voter turnout rate held steady at 47.6% in 2016, and then 48% in 2012. Now in New York State, we had a voter turnout rate mimic similarly to the national level. In 2008, we had a 58.8% rate, in which we ranked 43rd in the nation. In 2012, we dropped a little bit to 46.31%, and then in 2016, we dropped to 57% of voting eligible people participating in the electoral process. Now, you might ask what happened, and what happened is known as voter suppression. So that is any effort by a way of law, administrative rules and or tactics that prevent eligible voters from registering to vote or actually voting. These efforts parallel tactics that were used over 150 years ago in an effort to harass, obstruct, frustrate, and prevent American citizens from having a say in their democracy.
So the Reconstruction Era in the United States was the first time where Black people were allowed to vote in this country, specifically men. Women were still not allowed to vote at this time, but it was the first time that anywhere beyond just the white male population was allowed to vote. When this country was formed, it was actually even more restricted than just that. It was restricted to the white male population over the age of 21, and most states actually had a requirement that you own property in order to vote. So the Reconstruction Era was the first time that this changed. Changed in a mass way. After the Civil War ended in 1865, this period lasted a little more than 10 years. After that time period, in which federal troops occupied the South. And most of the reason why they were occupying the South was to ensure that Southern states, implemented the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. There's actually a clause in the amendments that says that if the states are not abiding by the rules that the federal government sets forth, that they would not be given their representation in Congress. So it was taken pretty seriously, and federal troops were literally occupying the South as if it were a foreign nation in ways that we do today. So this led to really high rates of Black participation in voter registration and actually participating in voting and election to office. There were Black people that were serving in Congress, serving in state legislatures, serving in local office all over the South. But this didn't last that long. It only lasted about 10 years. And I think it's really important to discuss this aspect of it because this isn't often spoken about. So in 1876, there was a presidential election. At the time, you have to remember that from what it is today, the two major political parties were still in existence, but their basic principles were reversed. This was right after the Civil War. It was right after the Lincoln era Republican Party had existed and still did exist to a certain extent. So Rutherford B. Hayes, who ended up becoming president, was the Republican candidate. He actually lost the popular vote, which has happened on 5 occasions in the United States, where the person who ended up becoming president lost the popular vote, and he was one of those 5 occasions. And if anybody remembers the 2000 election in Florida with the disputed, hanging chads and the disputed votes, the Electoral College debacle that happened, something sort of similar happened where there were disputed electoral votes in Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon for a total of 20. So Congress formed a commission to try to figure out what to do, to try to figure out what the election results were going to be. And they ended up awarding all of the disputed votes to Hayes. Whether or not that was the way it should have gone, who really knows? It's not like any of us were there at the time. And this led to what was then referred to as the Compromise of 1877. So in order to prevent the Democratic Party from contesting the election or dragging this out for longer than it needed to be dragged out for, Hayes and the Republican Party both agreed to two things. So first, that Hayes wouldn't seek re-election in 4 years. Even though he could have, and he could have just kept running, because this was before there were term limits on the presidents, and that the Republican Party would ensure that all of the federal troops were withdrawn from the South. And this may or may not have happened anyway because of the composition of Congress at the time, but it's important in the history of voting rights simply because withdrawing the troops is what led to the Jim Crow era and what led to basically everything that had happened in that 10-year period being eliminated essentially overnight. So without the federal troops there to enforce, the laws, to enforce the constitutional amendments that had been passed after the Civil War, there was just no one around to do the enforcement. So everything changed. So this was when Southern states started implementing poll taxes. And this was different depending on where you lived. And it was a tax that would allow you to vote. So if you didn't pay the tax, you weren't allowed to vote. And the worst part about this, the fact that it was even there is terrible, but the worst part about it is that back pay was required. So if you couldn't afford the poll tax in the 2020 election because you had a bad year and you couldn't pay, you could go and pay, in 2021, but they would back pay you and require you to pay the 2020 tax too. Even though there was no way for you to go back and vote in the 2020 election, they would still make you pay both of them. And this prevented a lot of people, especially this was specifically targeted, and the way that these laws were written were specifically targeted to disenfranchise Black men. Literacy tests were used. So literacy tests, again, depending on what county you lived in, what town you lived in, depending on who, the registrar of voters was, where you lived, this would vary, but it would test people, specifically Black people's ability to read, write, and comprehend. And this could be anything. They could ask you to read a passage of some obscure law. They could ask you to read some passage of some obscure law and then ask you what it actually meant. They would ask people to list every judge that existed in the county, in the state, whatever they felt like doing. And they could just keep asking you questions until you got to one that you couldn't answer and then tell you that you weren't allowed to register to vote. And then there was also the voter purges that happened. So they would, again, specifically, they were aiming to remove Black men from the voter rolls, remembering that Black women were not allowed to vote at this time in anywhere, really. But they would purge people from the voter rolls. So they would just go through and say that they were cleaning it up, and they would just take people off the voter rolls because they could, because there was no one there to stop them. And this is something that, Alex is going to talk about in a little while, but it's, this is something that still goes on today. If everyone remembers, right before the 2016 election, right before the 2016 primary election that happened in New York, there was a voter purge in New York, in Kings County in Brooklyn, and there were 150,000 people just taken off the rolls, primarily minorities who were taken off the voter rolls, and they couldn't vote on election day. And, again, Alex is going to talk more about this later, but New York, there are several counties, including Kings County, that were previously covered by the Voting Rights Act. So a lot of times, we talk about this in the sense that this is a Southern problem and not a Northern problem, but it's very much a Northern problem too. There are counties, there were no states that were fully covered by the Voting Rights Act in the North, where the whole state was covered, but there were quite a few counties that were covered by the Voting Rights Act. that aren't anymore because it's no longer in existence in the way that we want it to be. So this stuff happens here too. And there were also the grandfather clauses. So this is particularly heinous because what it did was it allowed anyone whose grandfather voted prior to the 1860s to register to vote without having to prove anything, without having to pay a tax, without having to take any kind of test, without being asked to read some obscure and arcane area of law and then interpret it. And these things were specifically put into place in order to ensure that poor and illiterate white people were allowed to vote, but Black people weren't. And these existed all over the South. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about right now is this Mississippi plan. So this is what ended up being referred to as the white primary. So again, putting yourself in the context of the time, you have to flip-flop the parties in your mind. So the Democrats completely controlled the South, the Republican Party completely controlled the North. And basically what would happen in the South is whoever won the Democratic primary was essentially elected to office. It's similar right now in New York City too, where there's just so many registered Democrats that the Democratic primary becomes the de facto general election. So even though you have to go on to the general election and get elected, if you win the Democratic primary, you basically win. So the South was like this in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So what Mississippi did was they passed a law declaring that political parties were private organizations. And this meant that they were exempt from the 15th Amendment. They were exempt from protections that ensured that everyone could participate because they were private organizations. They weren't public. So this created a white primary where they would say that if you had to be white and there was nothing that, could be done to change it. So this was litigated on numerous occasions, but this was Mississippi's way of basically saying that they just didn't want Black people participating in choosing who was elected. So you could go vote in the general election if you were Black, but their Republican candidates were not going to come anywhere near the Democratic candidates. There was no way that they could possibly win. So Alex is going to talk about the Civil Rights Act.
Good. Yes. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This piece of legislation prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin. It also prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex and race in hiring of employment and as well as firing. In addition to both of those things, in relation to voting, it strengthened the enforcement of voting rights and the desegregation of schools. Now, the Voting Rights Act banned the use of literacy tests. It provided for federal oversight of voter registration in areas less than 50% of non-white populations had unregistered voters. It authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in states and local elections, and it also required states to prove that any changes they made were necessary and fair, taking their responsibility off individual citizens. This was a fundamental piece of legislation when it came to voter turnout, especially for the Black voting population, because it did two major things that its predecessor, the Civil Rights Act of 57, did. Rather than passively wait for voting rights violations to occur, for those against those who have been wronged, to file a formal complaint, this iteration of the Voting Rights Act put the burden of responsibility to adhering to the Constitution on local and state governments. The Voting Rights Act also identified the jurisdiction that had the longest documented history of racial discrimination in voting and required that the federal court in Washington, D.C. Approve any changes to voting laws or requirements that those districts wanted before they were actually enacted, and this became known as pre-clearance. and this isn't something that's only known to the South. Kings County, as Jessica mentioned, in New York State was also one of these aforementioned states, areas, sorry. Yeah.
So these are a few things that happened in the 1960s and the early 1970s to just start expanding voting rights to different populations that are just important to note. So prior to 1961, Washington, D.C. residents had zero representation. In the federal government, they have no voting representation. They can send a delegate to the House of Representatives, and that's it. But they also had no vote in presidential elections. So in 1961, the Constitution was amended to make that change so that DC residents could vote in presidential elections. Again, they still don't have any voting representation in Congress. The 24th Amendment specifically prohibiting poll taxes in federal elections was passed in 1964. And then 2 years later, there was actually a Supreme Court decision that ruled that poll taxes are unconstitutional at all levels. So you can't be forced to pay a tax to vote in state or local elections either. And then finally in 1971, the 26th Amendment was passed, which lowered the voting age to 18. And this amendment specifically included federal and state elections.
Still muted. Awesome. So in the 21st century, 2013, Shelby County v. Holder was that court case that I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. And this was important because it got rid of the protections laid out by the Voting Rights Act. So this ruling made it so that states and localities with a history of suppressing voting rights were no longer required to submit the changes of their election laws to the to the U.S. Justice Department for review. The ruling was a 5-4 decision, and they ruled that it was an unconstitutional section of the landmark 1965 law that was key in protecting voters in these states with a history of race-based voter suppression. And with this, it led to modern voter ID laws, reduction of polling locations and hours, voter purges of the polls, and a reduction and elimination of early voting time, which became very problematic when it came to Black voters coming out to vote.
Yeah, so all of these things exist at different levels in different states, depending on where you are. One of the things that has persisted through all of this, though, has been felon disenfranchisement. So felon disenfranchisement is really rooted in this inequality that has existed since the Jim Crow era. And it was one way that states found to get around the 15th Amendment and to have courts actually rule in their favor is to say that someone committed a crime. So now, they've been convicted of said crime and they can't, have the right to participate in our democracy the way that everyone else can. But the fundamental issue with this is that a lot of the laws that we still have on the books today exist in a way to specifically criminalize behavior of certain groups of people to ensure that it's those groups of people that are being disenfranchised. So in New York, we don't disenfranchise everyone that has a felon conviction. You have to be in jail because you were convicted already. So you can still vote pre-sentencing. So you have to be in jail or on parole in order to not be allowed to vote. And that has actually changed. So we're in a little bit of a weird place right now where the law doesn't actually allow for people to vote. What Governor Cuomo did about 2.5 years ago was he started issuing restricted pardons. So it's not a complete pardon. So he's not pardoning anybody of the crime they committed. But he's issuing pardons to restore the voting rights of people who are no longer in jail on a conviction. So even while they're on parole, which they didn't used to be allowed to vote, or if, in some cases, if their maximum sentence wasn't reached, they weren't allowed to vote. So he's issuing conditional pardons just to restore the right to vote. There has been legislation that has been introduced, I think, every year for at least the past 3 years and possibly before that, to just by law restore the voting rights of people who are leaving jail. And the important difference between this is that if that law is passed, it's going to put the burden to re-register people. It's actually going to put it on the jails themselves, where it's going to be a requirement before anybody leaves prison that they are going to have to be told that they are allowed to vote once they leave. They're going to have to be given a voter registration form. And if they don't want to register to vote, they're actually going to have to sign a form declining to register to vote. The issue right now is that none of that happens, and you actually have to ask for the pardon right now in order to vote, which is a huge issue and a huge step for people to have to take once they leave jail. And oftentimes people don't know where they're going to sleep or how they're going to eat, or are living in shelters and don't know, they don't have their basic needs met. So going above and beyond that is really difficult. So this is another way that we just continue as a society to disenfranchise people. The next is this issue around gerrymandering, which, again, no state is free from gerrymandering. No state, can say that they have great voting districts. So what this means is most of the people that we're voting for, most of the offices that we're voting for, are districts. So it's not the whole state. It's not all of a county that you live in. For most of the stuff that we're doing, we're voting for a congressional representative. These districts are drawn to encompass a certain amount of people. So a congressional district right now, in a state that has more than one congressional district, so in New York State, each congressperson represents around 750,000 people. So these lines have to be drawn to encompass 750,000 people. They're drawn specifically to, keep certain districts certain ways. And most of them are drawn to rig the outcome of the election, to ensure that a Democrat or a Republican is going to win the election. Sometimes they're drawn to specifically cut up different communities. So I can tell you right now, in Hicksville on Long Island, Hicksville is covered by 3 different county legislative districts. So the community is cut up so that it is represented by 3 different people, which hurts the voting power of that community because now they're in 3 different districts. It's represented by 2 different Senate districts, state Senate districts. The community of Elmont, the same thing. Actually, the community of Elmont is cut up into 3 different New York State Senate districts. And I think it's cut up into 2 or 3 county legislative districts. So it reduces the power of the community to advocate on behalf of themselves because it's requiring one community to vote for 3 different people for the same level of government, for the same office. But it also ultimately reduces voter choice, especially when these districts are drawn to specifically ensure that a Democrat or a Republican is going to win a district. What ends up happening is that you either have to vote in a primary. There has to be 2 people that are running in a primary, which doesn't happen as often as people think it does because parties want to seem unified. They don't want, different members of the party primarying each other and making it seem like there's infighting and, things of that nature. They don't want 2 different people of the same party running against each other and trashing each other. So it would require that to happen, or, it just requires like a drastic change in the demographics of the district to swing it from one to the other, which doesn't tend to happen. So when you show up to vote on election day, it's just the other one person's going to win already. So you're either there to, give extra votes to the person you like, or to be one of the few that votes against the person that you didn't want. And it's just manipulating the districts to make it be a certain way. And this, this is done all over the country. It's worse in some places. It's been made a lot easier by computer technology and the ability to just put in, specific requests on a computer and have them draw the districts. And then voter ID laws. So voter ID laws are being implemented all over the country. And this really stems from the overturning of the Voting Rights Act. So, gerrymandering has been around forever. It's nothing new. It's something that's really difficult to get any court to get rid of. Felon disenfranchisement has been around since the Jim Crow era. And again, very difficult to get a court to get rid of something like that because, it's just something that they don't want to. These voter ID laws were specifically kept out of politics and were kept, away from a lot of specifically southern states and random counties in the north because of the Voting Rights Act. And once that was gone, they immediately started going into effect all over the country. What'll happen oftentimes, as did happen in a couple of states, including Virginia and Texas, is people will be allowed to use a rifle ID, a gun permit that they're given by the state to vote, but they can't use their college ID. And these laws are specifically tailored to ensure that it's more difficult for people of certain demographics to vote. There are counties and there are states that have voter ID laws right now that say that you can't use your Medicare or your Medicaid card. But again, you can use like your rifle permit card from the state. Or you need to have it, they'll just flat out say like you need to have some kind of state issued ID. But for people who don't have access or don't have a copy of their birth certificate, if you don't have a state issued ID, you can't then turn around and get your birth certificate, which means that you also can't get a state issued ID. So it's like this circle that you're running in, trying to get ID before the next election. And this has had a significant impact on elections in a lot of different states. And again, this is very targeted. There have been states that have had their voter ID laws overturned and had to rewrite them and reinstitute them, because even the courts that don't like to really answer these political questions have said that the states were writing these laws to specifically target groups of people, minority groups and young people, which is why most of the states don't allow students to use college IDs to vote at the polls. So we don't have a voter ID law in New York, thankfully. You shouldn't be asked to show your ID when you get to the polls. So I didn't want to leave you on a very sad note of all the things that we continue to do to disenfranchise people. I wanted to leave you on something a little more positive. So as I was talking about in the beginning, the Electoral College has been a huge part of it's been our electoral system for electing presidents since this country was founded, but it's also been a huge thorn in the side of a lot of people. So there have been 5 presidents who were elected who did not win the popular vote, and they specifically didn't win the popular vote because the Electoral College exists. So this has been happening since long before any of us were born. After the 2000 election, and what happened during that campaign, the National Popular Vote Act started. So the only way to get rid of the Electoral College is to amend the Constitution, to just not have to use it anymore, period, even as a symbolic thing. Right now, 48 out of the 50 states award their Electoral College votes to whoever wins the popular vote in the state. The only 2 states that don't do that are Maine and Nebraska, where they could potentially split the vote because of the congressional district. So if you win one congressional district and not the other, you could get a vote for that congressional district. And it happens. I think it happened in the last election in Maine. So they're the only 2 that don't use the winner-take-all system for the statewide vote. So the only way to completely get rid of it is a constitutional amendment. The last time we amended the Constitution in the United States was in 1992. It was the 27th time we had done it. And it related to how we pay members of Congress. So it's really unlikely that anywhere in the near future, anybody's going to get together in a bipartisan fashion and decide to amend the Constitution. Because we don't do things like that anymore, really. So what was proposed instead of this was this National Popular Vote Act, which is an interstate compact, so it doesn't need congressional or presidential approval to go into effect. It's where states just make an agreement amongst themselves. So the states that have signed on to this, what the act says is that the states who sign on to it will wait, and they will not award their electoral college votes until all of the votes in the entire country have been counted. And they agree to award the statewide electoral college votes to whoever wins the popular vote nationwide instead of just in their state. So this wouldn't go into effect. As you can see, New York has passed it, California has passed it, big states. This has been going on for the last almost 20 years. This wouldn't go into effect until enough states have passed it that it would that they would decide the election. So you need 270 electoral votes to become president, half plus one, and 270 states worth of votes have not passed it yet. So it has not gone into effect. So there are some states where they've passed it. So New York has signed on to it. So we've said that once enough states pass it, we will do this. Illinois, Washington, Oregon, so many different states have done it, even little states like Hawaii. Some states, one legislative chamber has passed it, but not the other. It was actually vetoed in Nevada by the state governor. Some places have talked about it. Some places have completely ignored it. Specifically, Florida has completely just ignored it because, states like the attention, and that's part of the argument over it, is that there are states, like New York that got pretty well ignored during presidential elections because we haven't switched our statewide votes since 1988. So we're pretty solidly, have been voting for the same party for the last, too many years. So we get ignored. So states that are getting ignored really like something like this because they would like for presidential candidates to pay more attention to them. There's money that comes with that in advertising and rallies that happen in different states and stuff like that. And then there are little states that don't have that many electoral college votes like Iowa that don't want anything to do with this because right now they're seen as a swing state. They're the first caucus in the nation. So they feel like they get more attention because something like this doesn't exist. So they don't want, they don't want to change the system the way that it is now. Whether or not it would really have a huge impact on the way presidential candidates campaign, there's no way to say for sure either way, but it is still pretty controversial, and a lot of places don't want, and a lot of people don't want anything to do with something like this. But it is something that a lot of people don't really know about. We don't talk about the Electoral College until the Electoral College annoys us. We pretty easily forgot that afterwards too, because other things happen. More important things go on, but this is something that has been around for the last 20 years, almost 20 years. It has been floating around the states, and it becomes more popular in and out. So, it's an option that I think more people should know about. So I always talk about it.
Yeah. But now we are bringing us back to the present. We are currently in a presidential election year. Can I get a quick check in the chat? What day is election day on this year? November 3rd. Excellent. And I can safely assume that all of you are registered to vote and ready to go. But just in case we need a refresher, we're going to just let you know that we're not only voting for the presidential and vice presidential candidate in the election this year, we are also thinking about who we would like to see on our New York State Senate and Assembly. Some things to think about are how our laws get made on the state and the federal level. It's important to have our executive and legislative branches of government be representative of the ethics that we hold as social workers, so that we can move forward and see policies that reflect these values get pushed into actual laws and benefit the communities that we work tirelessly to advocate for. So when you see that your friends are saying that they don't want to vote because they don't necessarily agree with the president, remind them that that's not the only thing that's on the ballot. Yeah. And for those same friends who are a little wary about voting in the election on the 3rd of November, you can show them this wonderful website to figure out if they're registered to vote in the first place. So maybe we can have this link dropped in the chat if you need to check that you are registered to vote. But it's super easy. You just answer a couple of questions and then it'll give you the all clear for you to go on election day. And
Actually, let me just, I'll open it.
Okay.
So you answer all of these questions and it'll tell you where you're registered to vote. It'll tell you where you need to go to vote.
Everything you might
stuff.
need.
Yeah.
Yes. And then also there are, given that we are in a post-COVID world, absentee ballots are being used more prevalently to cast your vote for an election. And I know you are all familiar with how to request them because you all voted in the primary this past June. But just in case, we have some useful links here that'll help you fill out the form to request an absentee ballot. You can also request an absentee ballot via paper form, and as of recently, like really recently, you can request it online. You can get your voter registration done electronically through the DMV. You can do a good old paper application form. Once you're in the process of filling out all of these forms, it's super important to remember the deadlines that are going to be passed. I believe October 9th is the deadline to request an absentee ballot form, and you have to submit your, if you're going to use an absentee ballot to cast your vote, I believe it needs to be submitted and at least postmarked by what, the 3rd? I mean,
yeah, it's a little confusing right now. So October 9th is the last day to register to vote. Request your absentee ballot immediately. I have some friends that work at the Board of Elections and they are just inundated right now. So don't wait until the last day. The absentee ballots can be submitted after October 9th. I'm like scared to even give people the deadline because I don't want you to wait. If you send it in on the deadline, you're not going to get it this year. They have too much going on. There's too many people requesting them. So there's no way you're going to get it, but it needs to be postmarked by the day of the election now. Governor Cuomo changed it again. So it needs to be postmarked by the day of the election if you are going to vote by absentee ballot.
Yeah. And if you're wondering, for those same wary friends about who might not believe you as to who is on the ballot besides the president, you can always look up who your representatives are on the federal and the state level. So if you go to the New York State government website, you can search your senators by district. You can search your assembly members, and the House also has these same systems set up so that you can find your representative on the federal level.
So these are just some resources too that I like to share with everyone because I think that people should read these books and look at these websites and watch these TV shows because they're very informative about the process. One Person, No Vote is a book that Alex and I are now obsessed with. It's really just eye-opening to see what we have actively done in this country to attempt to disenfranchise people. And it's really unfortunate. And it's something that, I say all the time that if we don't take advantage of what we have now in New York, that we're going to lose it. The state government spent They spent about $25 million last year doing early voting. And then basically the mark of like how many people voted barely ticked up at all. The 2017 election that we all think so many people got angry in 2016 and they were going to go out and vote. The 2017 election in New York, the voter participation rate in New York State was around 23%. We have elections every year in New York without fail. There is a general election in November. And if we don't start, participating, if we don't start using early voting, the state's not going to continue to fund it. A lot of the money that they spent last year was at like initial startup costs and buying the technology to actually do something like that. But if people aren't voting, it's still expensive to do. It's 10 days of early voting. It's 10 days of paying people to sit at the polls and replacing technology that breaks over the years. They're not going to continue doing it. I also requested an absentee ballot because I don't want to have to be in crowds of people. So I'm going to actually take a video of myself filling out my absentee ballot, and I will share it with Sam and Amelia so they can share it with people, because it can be a little confusing, and they did fix them for this election. They are going to make it a little bit easier so that less people mess it up. But once I get it, I requested it last week. They're not sending them out yet, but once I get it, I'm going to make a video of myself filling it out so that people can do it the right way. So yeah, if Alex, do you want to say anything else, or do you want to take questions?
I would love to start taking questions. Claire just dropped 2 very important questions in the chat that I'd love to call attention to. Claire, would you like to read your own questions, or would you like us to read it?
I can read them. My video is not working, so it's just my voice. But hi, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing all that information with us. I'm looking to just get really specific about what the NASW can do, or / what we can do as a group to for suggestions for how to increase voting in social workers, and then also more specifically for MSW students. This is such an important part of what brings us all to social work, this public advocacy. What can we do as social workers and as students to increase voting?
Do you want to answer, Sam?
Yeah, so we have 2 interns who just came on, and their whole focus in September and October is voting. So they're going to start posting on our social media sites. Amelia, I don't know how that works. Do you want to tell them how they can find our social media sites in the chat? Or you could tell them. But then the other thing we're doing is we're building a web page, a voting web page that's going to have like all the information. Everything we got was from Jessica and Alex. So like all the information they gave is going to end up going on there. And then they're also going to they're going to blast our social media so that no matter how people like get in touch with us, that we'll have several ways of doing it. And then I will also send an email to all the deans of social work in our area and let them know like when the page is live, and like to send their students there, and for them to social media. Amelia, do you want to tell them where we are on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. So our handle is simply NASW NYS on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I also just wanted to say, so we're doing a bunch of social media related things. Our interns are working on creating a web page for us, creating multiple social media campaigns, both in regards to getting people out to register to vote, doing a little bit of education about voter suppression, as well as talking about beyond voting, also getting more social workers actively involved in elected and appointed office. So definitely be on the lookout for that. The other thing I wanted to mention is we're working with Deona Hooper of Social Work Helper. They have first they're going to have a great summit coming up, an anti-racist summit coming up on the 17th. And then right after that, we're going to start working with her on a Get Out the Vote campaign, which is the road to November. So a few chapters are working together with Social Work Helper and other few organizations. So we'll be starting pushing that much more visibly within the next week or 2, since our interns just came on. So, and of course, as always, if there's anything that you want to contribute to our pages, we are open to suggestion and resources from any social worker. We're always trying to remember that our best resources are our members and other social workers. So if you see something that you want to be added to our site, just send it over to us.
Do you want to go ahead, Jess?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if there is anybody interested in running for office, I don't know what Amelia said, but it made me think of it, that please feel free to reach out to me because I'd be happy to help you because we need more social workers in elected office so bad. And I'm not kidding.
He's absolutely serious. So email her.
Yeah. I apologize. I just
Yeah.
want to respond to Claire. Claire has a few other questions. So the best way to get in contact with the chapter in general would be our info account. And I just put the info email into the chat box. We meet social workers, whatever the way that they can reach us. So if you want to, message us on social media, if you want to email us, we can meet you where it is. I'm also going to put in our staff list because you asked for the interns information as well. So on our staff list is all of the staff members, all of our interns, as well as our contact information.
Awesome, thank you. And then something else that Claire's original question made me think of, specifically referring to how to get MSW students to vote. As an instructor, I'm not an instructor, but as putting on okay, putting on the hat of someone who's teaching another person, I think putting forth the notion that social work operates on a continuum from clinical to macro is super important to getting folks to understand the importance of voting. So spreading education, understanding that the individual clients that you're working with or that your future MSW students are going to be working with are impacted heavily by the policies that govern their immediate surroundings and then govern their even further out surroundings on a federal level, will motivate them to pursue education that'll allow them to put people into office that uphold the values that we all hold as social workers. And I feel like that notion is missing, at least it was for me until I got my MSW and I met Jess and I did a lot of research and allowed myself to learn that it all interconnects, it all influences each other. And without that piece, until social work is consistently taught that way, that the macro leads into the micro and vice versa, there's going to be that disconnect involving people and the importance of voting, because we can come out here every day and give you the same presentation about the history of how this has been happening and how it's still happening, but until you fully believe that having someone who's going to put forth policies that affect the clients that you work with, if you are on the clinical side, it's not going to happen. So education.
Yeah, and Alex is lying. She is an instructor. She's overseen like 30 interns in the last 4 months because of COVID. So don't listen to that. But one of the most difficult things for a lot of my students is this disconnect between social work values and what they see candidates upholding. And I will say this until I'm blue in the face. You're never going to agree with someone 100% of the time except yourself. So you need to figure out what your deal breakers are for candidates. And if you really don't like them, then you need to just run for office yourself, because you're the only person you're always going to agree with all the time. So again, happy to help you run for office if you want to, because we need more social workers to do it.
And we also, not only in office, but in positions of decision-making and power. So in the intermedium, while you were not quite ready to take on the presidency or a senateship, you should get involved with your chapter. You should get involved with the PACE committee so you can have a say in what kind of elected officials are being endorsed. You should get involved with the ethics committee, the diversity. AGR, you should really get involved with AGR, especially the social justice committee, because we do really cool stuff. But honestly, Jess is right. You know your values, the ones that you uphold and the ones that you believe will further the things that you've been taught, especially as social workers and as an individual. So what better way to make sure that policies reflect those values than to be in positions that help get them put there.
Yeah, and I just want to comment on two things that Rebecca said. So one, Rebecca, thank you. That's really sweet, but I'm not constitutionally eligible to be president, thankfully, because it's the only excuse I have anymore. But the other thing is too, is that posting on social media is a great thing to do to make people aware, but it's not going to make people go vote, and it's not going to make people leave their couches. So it can bring awareness, but when it comes down to like the actual act of voting, it's like you really have to call your friends and text your friends and be like, did you go yet? Do you have a plan? Is a question you should ask everybody when it gets closer to election day. And when it gets closer to early voting, because we have early voting too, is like, what is your plan? If you just post on social media, people will like it and they'll move on and they'll stop. Like, they're not going to think about it anymore. But what is your plan to vote? You know, are you going to go in the morning? Are you going to go in the afternoon? Are you going to bring your kids with you, which you absolutely should? My mom used to bring me, and then she created this monster. I used to go with her when you used to be able to like pull the little lever down, which was so much more fun than it is now with a stupid pen and a piece of paper. But yeah, you really have to hound people and stay on them beyond just social media. But the awareness around social media is really important, and getting people used to having these conversations. You know, in my family, and I heard someone say it the other day too, but they always used to say, you know, you don't talk about politics and religion, and not talking about politics and religion is what has gotten us into the situations that we're in, because we think it's a luxury, you know, we think it's fine to ignore it, but it's really a luxury to ignore it. And we should be talking about it, and we should be having these conversations with everybody in our family, friends, whoever.
And especially us as social workers, because we are taught how to reflective listen and all the other wonderful clinical skills that you're taught your first year in practice classes, that you can put, I'm so serious, you can put them into practice when you're speaking to someone who has a view other than like one that you hold yourself. It is very useful into having those tough conversations and allowing the other person to actually hear what you're saying and not have it shrouded by anger. So have those conversations, be that person at the dinner table to ask if everyone's registered to vote, and then pull out your phone and with that with the new link for people to request an absentee ballot and get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and do it with your clients too. You know, you can, for those of you who are working in more micro positions, you know, you can't tell your clients who to vote for. You shouldn't tell your clients who you're voting for, but you can register them to vote. You know, you can tell them to go vote. Even people who work in like group type facilities now, this early voting thing is great. Because in most counties outside of New York City, so New York City is like its own separate entity, but most counties outside New York City, during early voting, you can vote at any of the polling places that are open. So if you're working with people in like a residential facility, like you can just stick them all in the residential facilities van one day and go on a trip, you know, go on a day trip to go vote and just bring everybody. You know, it's made it a lot easier because you no longer have to bring people to their specific voting location during early voting. Anybody can go anywhere. And again, you're not telling them who to vote, you're telling them to participate. And study after study has shown that communities, both geographically and as like communities of people, as social workers, as people who are dealing with specific issues, are better served by elected officials when elected officials perceive those communities as being high voter turnout. Because elected officials want their jobs back. And that's, you know, that's fine, but we want to hold them accountable and make sure that they're doing their jobs while they're there. And we do that by voting.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I have a really hard time talking and reading at the same time, but.
This is like perfect timing because it's 7 o'clock.
I know.
Lauren said she's a first year MSW coming from a totally different field, but encouraged and passionate about policy. Jessica has that impact on people.
She does. As her former student, she does.
And we are too at NAS, very passionate about policy. We do a lot of advocacy work. We have a fantastic policy coordinator that we're extremely lucky to have, Evelyn Williams. She has about 40 years experience in policy work, and she consults with our members. Our members choose our legislative agenda, like Alex said. So Alex is a member on one of our committees who is someone who chooses our legislative agenda with the consultation of the staff. Like talking to them about different ways to kind of get what you want and different ways to think about it. So yeah, if you're interested, definitely let us know. We're always appointing people to committees, and you are NASW, so we want you involved. Do you want to say any last words to everyone? I feel like we should go out with you two.
Go ahead, Alex.
I don't know what to say. I hope that you found the presentation to be informative. I love speaking about this topic. I hope that we have at the very least encouraged you to get involved in the decision-making process when it comes to who puts the policies in place for your communities. So that means getting out to vote not only this year, but every election year, which is just every year to come. It means getting involved in your chapter of the NASW. It means just allowing your voices to be heard, encouraging your clients' voices to be heard, and taking authority and ownership of the communities that you come from. And now Jess.
No, we were ending with you that you can't
What? Oh,
do better than
right.
that. So
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a
thank
good
you.
night.
Good night.
Thank you, you guys. Have a good night.
Thank you. Great job.